Hi Year 10, it's me, Mr. Azapadi. I'm doing another video on Christian views on war, and for the Religion, Peace and Conflict unit of the OCR GCSE. This lesson I've titled Christian Views on War, which might seem strange because we've already done a lot about it, but the idea is we're going to finish off Christian views on war by looking at three new viewpoints, three new points of view, Christian points of view that we haven't looked at so far about war, and then we're going to do an overview of everything we know. So first we'll go through these three new views, and then we'll do an overview. There is a file that I'm going to put on the in the files section of the Microsoft Teams page, which you can download from there. It looks like this, which I want you to fill in. I'll either print it out, fill it in, or make an electronic copy and fill it in. It was designed to be on A3 originally, so if you can get it on A3, that's good. Or just make sure you've got this information recorded in some way in your notes. Maybe just make a copy of the table. And so these are the five theories. Just war theory we've looked at, absolute pacifism we looked at last time, holy war, situation ethics and Christian realism we're going to look at today. So I want you to fill that sheet in, or at least have the information on that sheet in your notes in some way. As I go through the first three slides, these three new theories, you can make notes on them. Or I will also try and put these three slides up in the file section as well, so that you can just print off these if you want. So you've just got a record of these three theories. So you can make notes on them, but you don't have to. You could just print off the information on them and then use that information to make notes on the table. So as long as you've got the notes in the table, in that sheet there, then it's fine. Okay, first one is a theory called Christian realism. Quite an interesting theory because it's become quite popular in America, and it might help to explain how America is a very Christian country, but is also a country that seems quite willing to go to war. Okay, sorry, I'm just taking a break to have a cup of tea. Okay, so Christian realism was developed in the 1920s by American Protestant called Reinhold Niebuhr, great name. Now, Niebuhr believed that the pacifist teachings of Jesus cannot always be followed in the sinful world in which we currently live. So he thought the world was just too much of a terrible place for us to be to be pacifists, basically. So he argued that when Jesus returns and creates the kingdom of God at the end of time, which is what Christians believe. Christians believe that Jesus will one day return, and he'll create the kingdom of God on earth, and it'll be a perfect world again. He says that when Jesus returns, we can follow him perfectly. We can follow every teaching that he had. But until then, there are times when we can't be pacifists and we have to go to war. So, if you think Jesus says, turn the other cheek. If someone attacks you, don't attack them back. Now, that might be fine, Niebuhr would say, in the kingdom of God, because in the future, when Jesus comes back, he'll make the world perfect and there'll be no need to attack people back. However, until then, we live in a world in which there are lots of risks, and if you don't fight back, you might be destroyed, or evil people might be able to take over the world, or those kind of things. So his basic idea is, when Jesus returns and the world becomes this perfect place, yes, then we'll do what Jesus said. But before then, you have a responsibility to actually not always be a pacifist. You must try to use force and war to fight evil if you need to. Now, Niebuhr even rejects the rules of just war theory. He argued that governments have a duty to use force to maintain an ordered society, and that this means the normal rules of morality do not apply to them. So in other words, if you need to beat the opposition, if you've got an evil country or an evil leader of another country attacking you, and you need to defeat them to stop terrible things happening, then you can do anything. You can break the rules of just war theory. You can attack civilians and so on. you can do anything it takes to defeat them. So he doesn't even believe in those rules of just war theory. He just says sometimes you've got to go to war, and sometimes in war you've got to do things that are usually pretty bad. His ideas have been very popular among some Protestant Christians in the USA. Okay, that's Christian realism. Okay, next theory is the idea of holy war. So some Christians have believed historically in the idea of holy wars. I have mentioned holy war briefly, I think, in the first video in this series. So a holy war is a war which is directly influenced by religion or is seen as something that's commanded by God. People who believe in holy wars think that sometimes it is right to go to war because God has commanded us to go to war. So, God said we had to go, so we go. In the Bible, God commanded the Israelites to go to war. That's the Jewish people who were the main focus of the Old Testament of the Bible. He commands them to go to war against their enemies. And the language used to describe these wars is often quite bloodthirsty. Again, this was mentioned in the first lesson we did on war. So here's a quote about Joshua, who is one of the leaders of the Jewish people, the Israelites, in the Old Testament. It says, Joshua spared no one, everyone was put to death. This is what the Lord God of Israel had commanded. So, see, quite bloodthirsty language, and here God had commanded him to go to war, and not just to go to war, but to not even spare any prisoners, to kill everyone. Holy wars are not only found in the Bible. From the 11th to the 13th century, Christians went on crusades to the Holy Land, Israel and Palestine, that is. That is the land where Jesus came from. Because of the belief that it was their duty to God to take the land for Christians from the Muslims who lived there at the time. So at that time, Israel, or as it was later called Palestine, was the main people who lived there were Muslim, and the Crusaders were Christians from Europe who felt that God had somehow wanted them to go and attack that country and take it back for Christians. So that's an example of outside the Bible where you've got the idea of holy war. It's not that popular today nowadays amongst Christians. I mean, the main criticism would be, if God is all loving, why would he want people to go to war? Especially liberal Christians tend to just ignore those things out of the Bible, like that quote we've just seen. They tend to just think that surely the people who wrote the Old Testament must have been misunderstanding what God wanted them to do, because an all-loving God wouldn't have wanted them to do that. And even if people believe that God actually did want the Israelites to kill people in the Bible, the difficult thing would be, well, today he's not commanding anyone today to go to war. I mean, you might get some crazy people who feel like God has told them they must go to war, but generally there are not many Christians who believe in that kind of thing. Okay, the last one, situation ethics, is a theory we've looked at before, although you may not remember, although you really should, that its name is situation ethics. So this is the ethical system followed by many liberal Christians, and it was first created by a guy called Joseph Fletcher. You got one of his books on the right there. It says we could always follow the teaching of love your neighbour. Why do they follow that teaching? Well, in the Bible, Jesus is once asked what the most important commandments are, and he says the two most important commandments are to love God and to love your neighbour as yourself. And so their point there is, well, Jesus is basically saying that this is the most important stuff. If you love God and love your neighbour, that's what you should do. So followers of situation ethics basically say that if you're doing what's the most loving thing towards people around you, not just your neighbours, but everyone, that's more important than following every little rule in the Bible. If there's a clash between loving your neighbour and some rule in the Bible, they would say, go with whatever follows love your neighbour. Ignore the rule in the Bible and follow love your neighbour. Now, it's kind of confusing in a way, because when I first introduced this on war in a lesson, people often say, well, they're going to be against war because they want to do what's most loving. But actually, Joseph Fletcher thought that sometimes war was the right thing to do. The idea is it's acceptable to do if it's the most loving thing in a particular situation. So, for example, if you're going to war to protect innocent lives, the lives of innocent people, then it's acceptable because that is the most loving thing to do. So that's what Joseph Fletcher says. So yeah, you can go to war if it's the most loving thing. And in terms of criticisms of that point of view, obviously they're criticised. Situation ethics is criticised for picking and choosing from the Bible. So for example, Jesus says, "Turn the other cheek." He pretty much says it's wrong to fight back. But here's Joseph Fletcher saying it could be okay. The other thing is, one of the problems with situation ethics is it's quite vague. I mean, what is the most loving thing to do is not always something you can decide. And what if you look at a particular situation, you think, is it more loving to go to war or not to go to war here? It's very difficult to decide sometimes which is the most loving thing to do. Okay, so those are our three new things. If you look in, so here's your worksheet that I want you to work through. And again, if you can print it out, great, or if you can download it and take an electronic copy, fantastic. If that's tricky to do, if you can't do that, then just make sure you have some notes. Write out your own version of the table, and you can go through it like that. So I'm just going to talk you through actually the kind of things, just in case there's any problems with it, that you might want to put in each section. Okay, so let's have a quick look. So here are the different boxes. I've just put the top of it on here, so it's a bit clearer, it's a bit bigger. So for each view, I want you to explain, what does it mean? What's the view about war? Why would the Christian evidence or reasons for? So why do some people, why do some Christians think that's the right view? And then reasons or evidence against. How could that view be criticised? So let's just go through each one. Just war theory, there's quite a lot to say about what it is. It's this theory that was created by Thomas Aquinas, first by St. Augustine, later developed by Thomas Aquinas, about when it's okay to go to war and how you should act at war, and in more recent versions, how you should behave after war. So you've got the rules of jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and jus post bellum. And so basically it says you can go to war if the war follows all of those rules. Now, what's the evidence for this? Well, the evidence, the reasons that's usually given is to do with what we call the doctrine of double effect. So this is all, should be all in your notes in Just War Theories, but I'll just talk through it again. So Catholics are against killing because it goes against one of their precepts of natural moral law, which is the precept to preserve life. However, natural moral law allows you to break precepts in only in one situation, and that's if the aim of your action was not to break that precept. That was just a side effect of your action, and the aim of your action was actually following the precept. So Just War Theory would say, Catholic thinkers would say, that if you go to war for a just cause, then you are really going to war to preserve life. You're going to war to preserve the life of people. Therefore, your main aim is to preserve life, so therefore it goes along with natural moral law. The fact that you will also take some lives as a consequence of going to war is okay, because that is a side effect. It's not the main aim of why you go to war. You're going to war to preserve lives, but as a side effect you take some lives, so they allow killing in that situation for that reason. Okay, reasons against. Well, nice and easy is to say, well, but in the Bible, Jesus seems to be against war. He seems to be against any kind of violence. Whatever quote you use, turn the other cheek. You can use, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. That's something Jesus says in the New Testament, which suggests that, if you use violence, it will end up with death for yourself. There's so many things that Jesus says in the New Testament that seem to be against violence and war. So therefore, some people just say, well, war must be wrong. So yes, some Christians are against it. Absolute pacifism just means war is always wrong in every situation. This is the second one. Absolute pacifist is someone who believes all violence is wrong. So that means, quite straightforward, war is always wrong. Evidence for, well, turn the other cheek. I always say turn the other cheek, but the quote is something different. Make sure you've got the accurate quote. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also, something like that. Make sure you've got the correct quote there. So that's nice and simple. You can use "thou shalt not kill" in the Old Testament, but I prefer that Jesus quote. It's a better one to use because you can properly explain it in an SEE. Whether if you use "thou shalt not kill," it's very difficult to explain it because it basically is straightforward. Reasons or evidence against. I mean, the main reason that's used against pacifism is that if you look at the consequences of what will happen if people are always absolute pacifists, you could end up with some very bad consequences. So you could end up with, it could be that millions of people die because the country has refused to go to war. It could be that, this country would be living under a Nazi regime, and even more Jewish people in Nazi Germany were killed if the Allied forces had not taken the decision to go to war, if they'd been pacifists during the Second World War. So the main criticism of pacifism is look at the consequences of what would happen if every country became pacifist. Okay, next one, holy war. What is it? Well, it's a war that's commanded by God. A war that's, God commands people to go to war. Evidence for, go for the Bible, that quote about Joshua. There's evidence in the Bible that God commands people to go to war. If your evidence against, reasons against, main one would be from a more liberal Christian perspective, that God is all loving and God would not command people to go to war. And usually their idea, a liberal idea, would be that those parts of the Bible where God does command people to go to war cannot really reflect the true beliefs of God. They must be that the people who wrote the Bible misunderstood God's instructions or thought God was commanding them to go to war when he wasn't really. Okay, next one. By the way, I know this, I'm going through this very quick, but you've got all this information, so you can pause what I'm saying as I go through, but this is just really as a bit of a guide. You should be able to get all this information from the notes you have already. Situation ethics, Joseph Fletcher's theory that says the most important commandment is love your neighbour. Therefore, you can go to war, you can break Jesus' commandments, teachings about being a pacifist, but only if it's the most loving thing for all the people concerned. Remember, you're thinking about everyone. When it says love your neighbour, you're not just thinking about the people who live around you or your social group, you're looking at everyone. So you'd have to look at everyone who's affected by the war. Evidence for, the evidence for is that in the Bible, Jesus says, love your neighbour as well as love God is the most important commandment. So on that basis, that is the idea, is that it's because Jesus says this is the most important commandment that it makes people think, oh, well, then that means that following love your neighbour is more important than following any other rule of the Bible. So therefore, if war is the most loving thing to do, we should go to war, even though Jesus said fighting is wrong. Evidence against, reasons against, two things. One, picking and choosing from the Bible. You see, people would say, well, Jesus specifically said don't fight. So people would say, well, surely Jesus meant that. You can't just pick one teaching from the Bible. You see, just to talk about that more generally, Christians who are against situation ethics would say when Jesus said love your neighbour is the most important rule, he thinks the best way to love your neighbour is to follow every other rule in the Bible. That's what people who are against situation ethics say. So they would say there's no contradiction between love your neighbour and the rest of the rules in the Bible. They're all saying the same thing. But people who follow situation ethics take it to mean, no, love your neighbour is more important than the other rules in the Bible. So that would be one criticism. They're just picking and choosing which parts of the Bible they follow. The other way of criticising it would be to say that it's vague. Vague meaning it doesn't really tell you what to do in every situation. How do you decide whether going to war is the most loving thing to do? It's very difficult to decide sometimes. Last one, Christian realism, created by Reinhold Niebuhr, American theologian in the 1920s. What does it say? It says that, yes, Jesus did teach pacifism and not to fight back, but that set of rules can only be followed in a perfect world, which Jesus is going to bring about on this earth when he returns in what Christians call the parousia or the second coming. Parousia is a technical word that you don't need to know yet. But the second coming of Jesus, he comes back and he establishes a perfect world. And in that situation, yes, you can be a pacifist. But right now, when the world is full of bad people and evil countries and people we don't want to have power over us, we must use violence sometimes to defend innocent people against evil governments and evil rulers. So that's the idea of realism. And of course, you should need to add in realism. It's not only saying that sometimes it's right to go to war, but it's saying that you don't even have to follow any particular set of rules in war. You don't have to practice avoiding civilians and so on and so on and so on, because you just have to do whatever it takes to beat the bad guy, basically. What's his reasons? Well, I've kind of put the reasons in the first box here, I suppose, but the reasons are that he knows Jesus was a pacifist, but he doesn't think you need to be a pacifist now, because Jesus' teachings are for the world to come when Jesus returns. What's the criticism? Well, straightforwardly, nowhere in the Bible does Jesus ever say, I'm only teaching you these things for the future kingdom. Jesus never says, turn the other cheek, but not yet, do it in the next kingdom. He never says anything like that. He just tells people right there and then, turn the other cheek, don't fight back. So it doesn't seem like Jesus was really teaching people, oh, these aren't teachings I want you to follow right now. It seemed like Jesus wanted everyone to follow these pacifist teachings now. Okay, that was a long explanation from me of all those different theories. I hope it's clear. I will put the slides up for Holy War, Situation Ethics and Christian Realism on the files section of this Microsoft Teams page. Okay, well done for the work you've done so far, guys. Some people sent me some. Someone wrote a 15 marker, which was excellent. Well done to that person who wrote 15 marker. But I hadn't asked anyone to write 15 marker yet. But fantastic if you did. That's great. If there's any work that you want to send to me, I will be able to mark stuff. So yeah, that'll be great. My plan is to do another video this week about a 15 mark question based on everything we've done, and then you can have over Easter to do that 15 mark question, and then maybe over Easter I'll probably put some videos up, but I'm not expecting you to do that work over Easter because it's Easter, but I'll put some work so it's there, so just because I've probably got more free time over Easter to get videos done. Okay, bye.